now thrive. Moved by the times, the flowers shed their dew. The birds seem startled, they hate parting too. The steady beacon fires are 3 months old. A word from home is worth a ton of gold. I scratch my white hair, which has grown so thin, it soon won't let me stick my hat pin in. Um, but in my own poetry too, I found that I quite often gravitated to this Chinese syllabic count aspect, and there's an entire section of this book which is in words of a single syllable. This is about the house that I'm staying in England. It's the house of a poet called George Herbert, who is a wonderful metaphysical poet, and he was a rector in a small church just next to it, and he acted in a sense as my host. When I was staying there, I had the feeling that I was inhabiting his rooms, his stanzas, so to speak. I just wonder if the people behind the screen, I'm not talking about the announcement, but I can hear a continuous sense of conversation.
Susurration, yeah.
Susurration.
Yes.
Susurration, a nice word. My guys, I can hear. I can't speak because I'm hearing talk going on. I'm sorry, it's not distracting to you because you can hear me, but it's continuously in the background that's why you might have seen me looking a bit abstracted from time to time. Anyway. Host. So this is in a sense to George Herbert, but because it's all in words of single syllable, in a sense it's also a tribute to the three Chinese masters whom I talked about earlier. Host. I heard it was for sale and thought I'd go to see the old house where he lived 3 years and died. How could I know its stones, its trees, its air, the stream, the small church, the dark rain would say, "You've come, you've seen, now stay." A guest, I asked? Yes, as you are on earth. The means will come, don't fear. What of the risk? Our lives are that from birth. His ghost, his soul is here. He'll change my style. Well, but you could do worse than rent his rooms of verse. Joy came and grief, love came and loss, 3 years, tiles down, moles up, drought, flood. Though far in time and faith I share his tears, his hearth, his ground, his mud, yet my host stands just out of mind and sight, that I may sit and write.
So that's justification enough for looking east. If you looked east and got this, I think that's...
Thank you. I really owe a lot to so many poets of the past. I don't think I would have I wouldn't have written the Golden Gate, for example, if it hadn't been for a wonderful translation of Pushkin's poetry.
Charles Johnston's, yeah.
Charles Johnston's Johnston's luminous translation. Eugene Onegin, like champagne, its effervescence stirs my brain. And it's very nice to be able to thank him in the course of writing the poem. In fact, I did send Charles Johnston my book, not when it was published, but before it had been published. And he was very old at the time, and his wife had died recently, and he was he was a man beset by sorrow, and he really appreciated the fact that that the book was going to come out, and that it acknowledged him so fulsomely. But the sad thing was that when the book did come out, and almost every review of The Golden Gate mentioned Charles Johnston's excellent translation, by then he had died. Yeah. And so that's the way it was. But the great thing about the past and poets beyond English literature, which we are mainly taught about, is that it's open as long as you can get a good translation and as long as you have the time and curiosity to go there. But quite apart from going east and west or north, young man, we don't even seem to go south.
Exactly.
In other words, to our own heritage in many ways. For example, I think, Samantak, you were saying to me that, South Indian literature.
Basically, didn't exist for me until until well into my 20s or something like that.
So what happened then, and what?
Then I heard, I read some Ramanujan.
You read Ramanujan?
I read Ramanujan, and then I tried to access this. But that also brought me up against the problem, which is that of translation.
Yes.
If we had to go east or west or north or south or whatever.
Yeah.
And I ask you this because you're a practicing translator yourself, and how trustworthy are the translations that we have, let's say, of Chinese texts or Japanese texts or Indonesian texts? I mean, can we take them on in good faith? Because with South India, I mean, there are large overlaps, cultural overlaps. You can understand things.
Yes.
You can guess at things. But very often one is confronted with this enigma.
True, and some people try to make it even more enigmatic because they think, oh well, if you can cloak it in mist and mystery, then somehow it'll become more attractive. This idea of orientalization, but even further east, so to speak. I suppose what one could do is hope that you have 2 or 3 different translations of the same text, and then you can sort of triangulate inwards into what it might be.
Which is what you did with the Johnston translation of Onegin, didn't it? You looked at another translation and
true.
realized that it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. There were 2 translations in the Stanford bookstore, and both of them maintained Johnston's or Pushkin's rather tight stanzaic form, the so-called Onegin sonnet or stanza. But one of them was so clearly more colloquial, more feeling, more skilled than the other. You stopped noticing that you were reading a translation.
Right.
After a while, you stopped noticing that you were reading a poem at all. You were reading for the story and what happened to Tatyana and what happened to Onegin. Yeah. And it is a book which has a great deal of charm and a great deal of laughter and a great deal of sadness as well. Right. And I think there again, I think I learned from Pushkin that it's possible to move quite quickly between different registers without there being a perceptible hiatus.
Right. Let me try and sort of bring you back to form and another kind of form, which is the calligraphic form, because you've studied not just Chinese calligraphy but also Persian or
not
Arabic.
Persian, Arabic. Because
Arabic
the script that I studied was not Nastaliq, which of course we use here, but Thuluth, or Thuluth as we call it, which is quite often used for the ayats of the Quran.
Does that in turn discipline your writing? Because you're actually talking of a completely different form.
Yes, indeed. I mean, actually, in Chinese calligraphy, for example, you don't use the pen or the qalam or whatever, an appropriate thing to say today, the qalam. But you use the brush. The brush has been used for writing, not just for painting, for writing, for thousands of years. And the fact that you use the same implement for art and for writing means that that the one seeps into the other in many regards. Now there are different. I mentioned 2 Arabic styles, but there are many different Chinese styles of writing as well, which I won't go into here. But quite apart from the different types of scholar script or standard script or whatever, or seal script, there are also different speeds and levels of cursiveness or connectivity, which means you might be able to do a piece of Chinese calligraphy extremely fast, and yet it would be informed or imbued with the knowledge and the study of decades perhaps. The other thing that is very interesting about a piece of Chinese calligraphy is this: you can read it as literature, you can read it as art, and you can read it as music. Talking about bird song, you can read it as music. Now, what you can understand the first two easily enough. After all, the words are there. It might be a poem or something. So you're reading it as poetry, as literature. You can understand reading it as art because you see the entire shape of it in black and white with a little bit of red where the seal is. But what do I mean by saying reading it as music? It's this. When you write in Chinese, every stroke is written in a certain order. And so when you read a piece by a famous, or see a piece by a famous calligrapher as opposed to a famous painter, you don't ask yourself, was the left eye painted before the right eye? Did he do the trees first and then the ducks in the foreground? None of those questions come into play. You know exactly in which order everything has been written down to the smallest stroke. And as a result, you can enter the calligrapher's mind. Why did he pause here? You can tell from the thickness of the ink. I'm sorry. I hope everyone has turned off their mobile phone, unlike me. Okay. So, I better turn it off because today being that... Yeah, the Judgment Day, yeah. So I'm getting... Quite appropriate that we're sitting near Victoria Memorial.
Listening to you.
I'm sorry?
Listening to you.
Yeah, well, yes, and yes. Victoria has a lot to answer for, or at least to make light of something that is too serious, actually. But where was I? Oh, yes, music. I'm sorry, I should have asked for a projector or something, but this is 2 lines, Feng Huo Lian San Yue. Yeah, the beacon fires connect 3 months. Yeah, Shu Wan. And a letter from home would be worth 10,000 pieces of gold. And it's written on the original, you'd be able to see where the tip of the pen, tip of the brush went down to provide you with the bone, so to speak, and where it bled into the Chinese rice paper to give you this muscle. So you can't correct it. It's just done in a single movement, in a sense.
And this is by you, incidentally.
Well, yeah, I did that piece of calligraphy. But I mean, I had to get permission from my teacher. I said to him, look, are you going to be embarrassed by this? So finally, when he found something that was satisfactory, he said, no, that will do.
Okay, so how many times do you have to do the same thing?
I wouldn't embarrass myself by telling you. But at any rate, so where did he pause? Why did he ink there? Why did he put this cluster of words together? So you're reading it through time. In other words, you're reading it diachronically, which is what I meant by music. It's being read as time passes. You can see exactly what he's doing, or imagine what he's doing. So it's an incredible, wonderful, complex form. At the same time, it's very spare. There are only 2 colors with a touch of red. So there it is. I mean, I must say, there was a time when I was spending more time. In fact, I'd say a year or so more, when I was spending more time doing Chinese calligraphy than anything else. Yeah. And so even though I haven't visited China after that dreadful massacre on the square, Chinese culture has formed a huge part of my life and has enriched my life immeasurably.
Right, so I think that is, again, to repeat myself, something, here's a living embodiment of why we should go east, and also south, and also north and west, but we should.
And maybe also inwards.
And maybe also inwards. But the sheer discipline, and the hard work that you have to put in and then make it appear effortless. I was reminded of this because, to my mind, you're the first sort of, very well-known international figure, world citizen sort, Indian, who's been talking about going to China, looking to the east after Tagore, almost 100 years after him. In between, I cannot really think of people asking us to look to China, except for the Naxalites saying, go and read Mao's Red Book, which is trivial, in a sense. But why do you think this happened? Here's this huge civilization, right next door, with whom we've had encounters for millennia, and yet not much interest. Would you agree there hasn't been much interest? I can't recall any interest in my...
No, I must say, before you ask this question, it must surprise you, but I hadn't given the subject much thought, because as to why. I mean, I know that the Chinese came to us, Xuanzang, Fa Xian, to mention only, and
And
Buddhism
well,
and so on. I suppose we have got something from the Chinese, the civil service, but indirectly. The Chinese had a civil service 2,000 years ago, really, through competitive examinations for more than 1,500 years.
yeah. And Kolkata Chinese food, which is nothing like
I suppose.
Chinese food.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Calcutta Chinese telling me when we went to China and we hated it there. And I said, why did you hate it? They don't know how to cook. So
I see. Yeah, they don't cook Chinese food the way we like it. I see.
Yeah.
Well,
But
I don't really know. And actually, I would you mind if I asked you why you think it is so?
I have no idea. I mean, Tagore, of course, was a contrarian in many ways. He was
Correct.
saying everybody's looking west, you look east. Everybody's sending their son to England to become a lawyer. He sends his son off to America to become a farmer, and
Right.
so on and so forth. And maybe there's a bit of that spirit in you as well. But
Yeah.
I just find it very interesting that no Indian with this sort of voice, I mean, who's going to be heard on an international stage, is asking us to look east. If it is now, if we are now looking east, it's with fear and fear and loathing. The Chinese are going to take us over, that kind of thing.
I don't know. I mean, as I said, the fear, loathing, and ignorance, I think, was stronger after the Sino-Indian conflict.
62 years.
62. I think, and particularly after the Hindi-Chinese bye-bye, we have a lot to answer for in that conflict as well as
Absolutely.
they. And as I said, the 59 to 61 famine might have been one reason why they were looking for an external adventure, so to speak. But, I mean, if you actually read the correspondence, I mean, we were ridiculously complacent and also fairly arrogant. And of course, they also are very not xenophobic partly, but also very nationalistic. So it was something bound to happen unless a compromise of some sort was made. Now it's interesting that the two countries are basically saying, look, let's just get on with other subjects and leave this thing for a while. When we trust each other sufficiently, something will happen and we'll hopefully sort it out. But each of us is looking in a fairly realistic and beady-eyed manner at the other, militarily.
Which you think is
and
a
so
good
on.
thing.
Well, I think you have to guard your borders. Absolutely.
So you're not a pacifist. I mean, you've written against. I mean, you haven't been to China after Tiananmen. You've
Well-
written against the Iraq War, but would you call yourself a pacifist?
Well, mowing down your citizenry is not a war. It's just brutality
No,
of
that's
the
what I'm
worst
saying.
nature. Sorry. With the Iraq War, actually, funnily enough, I was in England at the time, and I actually protested. Now, I don't think that it's right necessarily to go to someone else's country and start telling them what their policies should be. But in this case, it was so clearly against even British interests, quite apart from the question.
You mean
of-
the Iraq thing?
Yeah, the Iraq War.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I say that? Oh, no, I may not have made that clear. It was so clear that I thought I would protest and speak out and also go on this kind of march through Hyde Park. And there's no excuse for that war, I don't think. Basically, the country and America and so on were misled into that war, and it led to several 100,000 deaths. I'm talking about Iraqi deaths, quite apart from other deaths, So I think when I was writing, well, I don't think that I'd abjure every war. I think that I'm not a Gandhian pacifist in that sense, but I certainly think that certain wars are simply, by their nature, unjust, and as a result, the suffering that is invariably occasioned by war has to be seen as a form of culpable homicide. If you create a war when you know that people are going to die, and you create it in a spirit of adventurism, yes.
Okay, I think there are people in the audience. I know there are people in the audience who are dying to ask you questions. So maybe we can take a
Absolutely.
few questions from
I'll-
them and.
And maybe should I just finish? I'll finish off with the Chinese beastly tale.
Okay.
Okay. So, at least I can see the audience, which is nice. During my previous session, unfortunately, it was dark, so I could just barely make people out. So, if once you get the mic, if you just stand up, that would be great. Please, please.
Shall I ask my question now, or
Ask now. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
okay? No, this is actually tying up with what you had said 2 days ago when you're talking about Section 377. So I'd like to bring those two conversations, 2 days ago and today's. I'm talking particularly about Chinese queer literature, and I'm talking particularly about, say, the whole culture of the Tongxi comrade. Which
同志.
Tongshi, right, thank you. And also about the tales of the cut sleeve, which is a big tradition of sort of male love in Chinese literature and in Chinese culture. Considering you've got such well-developed interests in Chinese literature and culture, have you ever considered sort of translating Tales of the Cut Sleeve into English, if it's possible?
Actually, when I translate, I mean, I'm sort of dragged into translation against my own muse, so to speak, who tells me, hey, you should go and write your own stuff. But the Duan Xiu, or the cut sleeve, comes from a story of an emperor who had, male concubines as well as female ones, and his favorite, or maybe that emperor only had male concubines, or friends, or whatever you'd call them, and the emperor had to perform his duties, but his friend was asleep on the rather large sleeves of the imperial cloak, and rather than wake him up, the emperor cut the sleeve so that he wouldn't disturb his sleeping friend, and then went to do his duties. So as a kind of euphemism, the Chinese have often said, rather than saying "tong xing lianai," rather than saying the same-sex attraction, they sometimes just say the cut sleeve, and people understand what they mean. Or 同志, which means of the same mind or mentality, or same intention, let's say.